June 22nd, 1941. German shells slam into the walls of Brest Fortress. Before daybreak, the barracks are left in ruins and radios are left silent. Soldiers of the Red Army claw their way out of the dust, scrambling into shattered bunkers. They are surrounded, outgunned, and cut off with no orders, but they fight anyway. While these soldiers weather the onslaught of airstrikes, artillery, and flamethrowers, Soviet civilians carry ammunition to their aid, and nurses drag wounded defenders back from the fighting. Graffiti scrawled on fortress walls says it all: "I'm dying, but I won't surrender." In the months leading up to June 1941, the Soviet Union appeared to be at peace with Nazi Germany. Both powers had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August of 1939. Its secret protocols carved up Eastern Europe between them, while its public statement of non-aggression allowed the Germans to focus their war effort on the Western Allies. For Stalin, it was a strategic play. The pact caused dissent among the Western capitalists, weakening their cause. It also gave time for the USSR to further build up their power base as they moved beyond Poland to seize the Baltic states, Bessarabia, and northern Bukovina. The Red Army had dramatically expanded its borders, but it did so under a false sense of strategic security. Behind the scenes, intelligence reports revealed alarming news. Soviet agents, border guards, and even foreign diplomats warned that German forces were massing along the western frontier. Stalin was skeptical. Not only did he suspect that the British were spreading false reports to drag the USSR into the war, but he actually believed Hitler's assurances that the massive transfer of German troops to the Soviet border was done to avoid British aircraft. Even when the GRU and NKVD presented evidence of German troop concentrations and intercepted communications, he dismissed many of their claims. Hitler himself wrote to Stalin, telling him that if there were any provocations from the German side, the blame should fall on disloyal generals. Instead of responding with military force, Stalin should instead show restraint and contact German officials through diplomatic channels. Part of this disbelief in a German attack also stemmed from Stalin's deep mistrust of his own military intelligence. The Great Purge of the late 1930s had gutted the Red Army and state security groups. Thousands of experienced officers, including most of the senior command, had been removed, whether through dismissal, imprisonment, or even execution. By 1941, an astonishing 75% of Red Army officers had been in their posts for less than a year. Experience had been replaced by obedience and fear, as the cautious, disoriented military hierarchy became too afraid to report bad news if it risked upsetting Stalin. Adding to this were serious issues in Soviet deployment. The occupation of Poland and the Baltic states had moved their frontier nearly 160 to 402 kilometers, or 100 to 250 miles west. Many of the fortifications and defenses on the old border became ineffective, while Soviet divisions stationed in the new occupied territories were left dangerously exposed. Airfields, barracks, and command posts were vulnerable to immediate strikes because new defenses had been delayed or outright reversed. Worse still, the Red Army had no defense in depth. Instead of layering their forces with staggered fallback lines and strategic reserves, many Soviet formations were deployed in a forward concentration near the border. It effectively meant that any German spearheads that broke through the initial defensive line would find little resistance behind it. These defensive hiccups were not seen as a major issue thanks to the Soviet doctrine of the time. The Red Army of 1941 was actually built for offense, since the prevailing view emphasized that any future war would involve overwhelming any neighboring countries they wished to subjugate. Much of this confidence came in the massive numbers of Soviet armor. Brand new T-34 and KV tanks were also considered some of the best in the world. However, they only made up a small portion of the total Soviet armor. The vast majority of Red Army tanks consisted of obsolete, mechanically unreliable models like the T-26 and BT series. Many thousands of these tanks were crippled by a lack of radios, spare parts, recovery vehicles, and trained mechanics. Superior numbers meant little without logistics or an adequate support network. Similar issues also plagued the air fleet. On paper, Stalin's air force was the largest in the world, but this numerical superiority obscured a major problem. The backbone of its fighter fleet consisted of obsolete Polikarpov I-15 Chaika and L-16 Ishak aircraft, which performed well in the Spanish Civil War and against the Japanese at Khalkhin Gol, but were outclassed by the Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt Bf-109s. Modern replacements like the MiG-3 and Yak-1 were only just trickling into service, and their pilots were undertrained and underfamiliar with the new machines. Most importantly, thousands of these aircraft were concentrated on the exposed, unconcealed airfields packed against the German border, making them easy targets. Special thanks to today's sponsor, OpusClip, the #1 AI video editing tool that transforms your long-form content into shorts with just one click. Editing down a full video in short-form content can be time-consuming and expensive, but OpusClip makes it fast and easy by automating the short-form video workflow. From impressive auto-import features that can pull in your latest YouTube videos and instantly auto-edit them into social-ready clips, to new AI auto-subject tracking that automatically detects, tracks, and reframes your scene to make sure the object is always in the center. OpusClip is more than just a clipping tool, but a leading AI video editing platform that saves you time so you can focus on creating content and expanding your reach. It's also affordable, and I can't recommend it enough as a great tool for creators of all sizes who want to get the most out of their content. So, whether you're already a successful creator or have always wanted to start your own channel, start transforming your videos into moments with OpusClip by clicking our link in the description and use code HISTORY to get 1 week free and 50% off for 3 months on your subscription. On the dawn of June 22nd, 1941, the illusion of peace was finally shattered. Without warning, the Wehrmacht opened fire across a front stretching over 2,900 kilometers or 1,802 miles. Artillery began pouring down all across Soviet forward positions. Luftwaffe bombers flew over the border in vast waves. Airfields, barracks, and depots were all hit at once. In the words of one Soviet pilot, "I tossed aside a tent flap and saw planes with German crosses strafing the tents. Everyone leaped out and saw that there were killed and wounded in the neighboring tents. I pulled on my overall, grabbed my map case, and ran toward the hangar. The planes on watch, which had been lined up nicely, were already ablaze." Within that first day, the Soviet Air Force lost between 1,800 to 2,000 aircraft, with many of those lost still on the ground. The Red Army was caught in the open. Units were deployed close to the frontier without proper entrenchments or fallback plans. Communication lines were severed early, and headquarters struggled to understand what was happening, let alone respond to it. Entire divisions were left leaderless or surrounded before they could even assemble. At the top, silence. For nearly half a day, Stalin gave no formal orders. Despite weeks of warnings, Hitler's manipulation of his anti-capitalist paranoia led Stalin to believe that the incoming reports of German attacks were false flags meant to destabilize the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. On the front lines, there was no chance for officers to take the initiative, since the Soviet High Command was purged years earlier. What remained was a cautious, fractured officer corps that hesitated to act without direction from above. As the invasion pushed the front lines further toward the Russian heartland, commanders were unsure whether to resist or await confirmation. Rodion Malinovsky, who served as a major general, recalled asking, "Could we open fire if the enemy invaded our territory?" To which the only answer was, "Do not succumb to provocation and do not open fire." Even with the chaos, pockets of Soviet resistance did emerge. One of the first roadblocks for the Germans came at the Brest Fortress in Belarus. Germany's 45th Infantry Division expected to seize the complex within hours. Instead, they found themselves locked in brutal close-quarters combat. Cut off and without orders, Soviet troops were joined by nurses and civilian family members as they turned the shattered fortress into a maze of improvised strongpoints. With no hope of relief, they held out against artillery, flamethrowers, and airstrikes for 8 days. Further north in Lithuania, the Soviet 2nd Tank Division rushed to counter the German 6th Panzer Division east of Rasinii. Most were crushed quickly, but some of the heavier Russian tanks were able to bloody the smaller panzers. In one instance, a single KV-2 heavy tank managed to cut off a key German supply route, holding it alone for nearly 2 days. The KV's crewmen withstood everything, from anti-tank guns to artillery and even satchel charges, before the tank was finally knocked out. It was an isolated success, but it showed that Soviet armor could outmatch the Germans tactically when they were deployed in the right conditions. Back at the Kremlin, things remained eerily quiet. Hours after the invasion began, there was no formal directives from the top. Stalin was racked by indecision. Years of trusting Hitler's false reassurances and ignoring mounting intelligence had left him blindsided. For much of June 22nd, he was adamant that the massive invasion was merely a provocation by rogue German generals. He continued forbidding his commanders to cross the border and ordered them to avoid actions that could worsen the situation. As German divisions flooded in, Stalin was still trying to reach Berlin by telephone, convinced Hitler would rein in his army. Eventually, Stalin began sobering up to the reality of the situation. But he remained elusive to the Soviet public. It fell to Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov to speak for the state, announcing that the USSR was under attack during a radio broadcast on the afternoon of the 22nd. The next day, Stalin quietly convened the Politburo to issue his first concrete orders: the formation of the Stavka, the general headquarters, with Marshal Semyon Timoshenko as its head. Defensive lines were drawn, as the Soviet Union was now fully at war. Over the following weeks, the Soviet Western Front fought tooth and nail to delay the German blitzkrieg. But the haphazard nature of the Red Army's defense nearly led to a complete collapse of the entire front. Major encirclements at Białystok and Minsk saw 4 entire armies surrounded and cut off. By July 9th, more than 341,000 Soviet troops had been killed, missing, or captured, while materiel losses included thousands of tanks, guns, and aircraft. The situation wasn't any better in the south. In Ukraine, German and Romanian forces pushed deep toward the Dnieper River, leaving 2 more Soviet armies trapped in the Uman pocket by early August. Behind the front, the Luftwaffe was wreaking havoc on Soviet infrastructure. Factories, supply depots, and transport hubs were being hit hard by bombing sorties. Any railway lines that were still operable were clogged with retreating units, refugees, and wrecked equipment. Ammunition dumps and airfields had to be abandoned in haste. The scale of the disaster forced the state to begin a massive emergency response, as key factories were dismantled and loaded onto trains bound for the east. Even under German air attack, the Soviets began moving their industry piece by piece beyond the reach of the advancing front. With more distance between them and the front, Soviet industry could continue ramping up production of much-needed supplies, vehicles, and aircraft. Back at the Kremlin, the Soviet leadership was slowly recovering from its paralysis. After 10 days of public silence, Stalin finally emerged to address the nation in a radio broadcast on July 3rd. There was no more talk of diplomacy. Casting aside the formal language of the General Secretary, Stalin called on his fellow citizens to rise in defense of the motherland, to form partisan units behind enemy lines, and to prepare for a long, brutal war. A month later, Stalin discreetly assumed the role of Supreme Commander-in-Chief. As the Red Army won more victories on the front, Stalin's position became more publicized. As the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, he was placing the defense of the entire USSR squarely on his shoulders. By mid-July, the Red Army was left beaten and bloody, but not broken. As German forces pushed toward Moscow, the Soviets managed to consolidate the front enough to delay their advance at Smolensk. Since the beginning of July, Marshal Timoshenko poured every resource he had into blunting the German spearhead. Eventually, Army Group Center was able to surround the city and many Soviet field armies by the end of the month. But it came at a cost. Not only did a large number of Red Army troops from the 19th and 20th Armies manage to escape back to Soviet lines, the delayed German victory had completely disrupted their deadlines for Barbarossa, putting their already fragile logistics in peril. By late August, the Red Army was ready to strike back. West of Smolensk, Soviet forces under General Georgy Zhukov launched a successful counterattack near the town of Yelnya. It cost many lives, and the strategic gains amounted to little, but it was an important morale boost for the Red Army. Yelnya was the first time that Soviet troops had forced the Germans to retreat. While battles continued to rage across the main front, resistance was also forming across the occupied territories. In the forests and villages of Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia, many isolated soldiers, political officers, and civilians began to organize. With few weapons and little support, these early partisan bands struck rail lines, ambushed convoys, and launched assassinations whenever they could, before vanishing into the trees. Later on in the summer, coordination with the NKVD began to improve, as partisan detachments behind enemy lines became more structured and tied closer to wider NKVD operations. While they didn't stop the German invasion, partisan activities did force the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS to divert precious resources to these territories, making their supply situation even worse. Other sectors of Soviet intelligence were also quietly at work. NKVD cryptanalysts under Sergei Tolstoy had successfully decrypted Japanese diplomatic traffic, which contributed to the later assessment that Japan would not attack the USSR. Meanwhile, Red Army codebreakers began intercepting messages exchanged between the Romanian High Command and General Erich von Manstein's forces in the Ukraine, giving them a wider picture of the strategic situation. By the late summer of 1941, Soviet commanders on the front lines reported an unexpected shift in German activity. Armored formations that were supposed to be gunning straight for Moscow were veering north and south. To the Soviet High Command, it became clear that the Germans were no longer concentrating solely on the Central Front. In the south, Red Army commanders warned of a massive buildup aimed at Kiev, but Stalin refused to authorize a withdrawal. Instead, the Southwestern Front endured a valiant but ultimately futile defense of Ukraine that left them encircled and destroyed. Total casualties amounted to nearly 760,000 men, with over 486,000 of those left killed or missing. The Southwestern Front's commander, General Mikhail Kirpanos, also perished in the fighting. Despite these terrible losses, the delay was not without consequences for the enemy. While the front collapsed in Ukraine, the central sector remained quiet. This central pause gave the Soviets time to form new armies, reposition defenses, and continue the process of industrial evacuation. To the north, The defenders of Leningrad were holding the line against the combined forces of Army Group North and the Finnish Defense Forces in Karelia, who had reached the outskirts by September. Germany's 4th Panzer Group spearheaded the assault, but failed to reach any further than the outskirts. Instead, the Wehrmacht encircled Leningrad, placing the entire city under a siege that would last 872 days. Within the city itself, the Red Army defenders established a perimeter of resistance that was reinforced by naval units from the Baltic and over 135,000 members of the People's Militia, ordinary volunteers who were handed rifles and sent to man the defenses. The remaining civilians, still trapped in the city, soon began to suffer immensely, as starvation, bombardment, and disease claimed hundreds and later thousands of lives per day. Due to the encirclement, relief efforts were extremely difficult. But Soviet forces managed to maintain a tenuous lifeline across Lake Ladoga. This road of life was a narrow route that allowed small amounts of supplies to trickle into the city whenever the lake was frozen over. Though inadequate to meet the city's full needs, it helped stave off total collapse over those 872 days. Meanwhile, the renewed German drive on Moscow sparked panic among the defenders. This was something Stalin wanted to curb before it grew out of control. Red Army leadership had been in constant flux since the invasion began, and senior commanders who failed to carry out Stalin's directives were either punished with demotion, dismissed, or even executed. This policy was made brutally clear with the execution of West Front commander General Dmitry Pavlov and his staff back in July. However, in late October, the consequences of failure was again made clear when 25 officers who had been previously arrested were summarily executed near the cities of Kuibyshev and Saratov. While ruthless, Stalin was stringent when it came to eliminating failure during one of the most pivotal moments of the war, and the Stavka had no room for weak or incompetent leaders. German delays on the Central Front allowed the newly consolidated defenses at Moscow to raise new armies, reorient logistics, and dig defensive lines around the capital. Stalin placed General Zhukov in charge of the city's defense, while hundreds of thousands of reservists and recruits were mobilized from across the country. A handful of divisions from the east were also redeployed to reinforce the front, but most of the units defending Moscow were newly formed, rebuilt, or drawn from existing reserves. By early autumn, the Red Army around Moscow was no longer scattered and reactive. It was entrenched, reinforced, and preparing for the fight to come. Throughout these tenuous months, the shifting seasons brought a new kind of pressure to the Soviet campaign. When autumn arrived, the infamous Rasputitsa, Russia's seasonal mud, choked roads, drowned vehicles, and delayed movements across the front. It was miserable, but far more manageable compared to what the Germans were going through. Defensive works continued under grueling conditions, while reinforcements and supplies slowly reached the lines. On the home front, the USSR was able to secure vital aid from the Western Allies, thanks to the efforts of Soviet ambassador Maxim Litvinov. In October 1941, the first protocol of the Lend-Lease Agreement came into effect. Though limited in scope at this stage, these initial shipments brought urgently needed raw materials, boots, trucks, and food. Deliveries came through the Arctic route to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, where the Soviet Navy played a crucial role, escorting, offloading, and defending the cargo under constant threat from German air and naval forces. Even as the ice thickened and the Luftwaffe prowled overhead, naval crews and dock workers labored to ensure that these supplies reached the front. Ultimately, the first protocol shipments were modest, but their inclusion was valuable for sustaining morale. Late November saw the Rasputitsa freeze over completely, creating a new set of problems. Temperatures plummeted, and the front was locked in place. Soviet units still suffered from supply shortages, leading to incidents of malnutrition, ammo shortages, exposure, and even frostbite. However, Lessons from the Winter War had taught Soviet commanders to remedy the situation as quick as possible. Red Army transport battalions used everything from trains, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, sledges pulled by reindeer, and even caravans of pack mules to bring in much-needed supplies from the rear depots. The climate itself didn't offer the Soviets an outright advantage, but their shorter supply lines meant that they could respond to the issues far easier. Even before December, Soviet reconnaissance had confirmed that German units were overstretched, undermanned, and incapable of pushing any further with their offensive. Wehrmacht forces were battered by months of combat and strangled by their own logistics. Now, they were stalled just kilometers from Moscow's outskirts. It was here that the Stavka saw its opportunity. Over several days, the Red Army quietly finalized its preparations. More than 1 million Soviet troops were assembled on the western, Kalinin, and Bryansk fronts as new rifle divisions, fresh artillery units, and tank brigades were all brought into position. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive began. The initial strikes caught the Wehrmacht completely off guard. Red Army divisions launched coordinated strikes along a broad front, focusing on vulnerable German flanks. In the following weeks, they pushed the enemy back 100 to 250 kilometers, or 62 to 155 miles from the capital. Towns like Kaluga, Klin, and Kalinin were then liberated in rapid succession. Soviet morale soared. For the first time since June, the Red Army was dictating the tempo of the war. The victory wasn't total, however, as German units dug in, and the front soon stabilized. But the psychological shift was enormous. Moscow had been saved. The myth of German invincibility had been broken. Inside the USSR, this triumph became a powerful rallying point. Propaganda showed the struggle as proof of the people's endurance and Stalin's strategic foresight. In truth, it had been a brutal, improvised campaign paid for in blood. Since June, the Red Army had suffered over 4.5 million casualties, with 2.3 million of those being captured and left to an abysmal fate in German captivity. The cost of survival had been staggering. But against all expectations, Operation Barbarossa had collapsed. Moscow still stood, and the Red Army had weathered the storm.